May 1944. The North Pacific. A U.S. Navy destroyer commander screams the order. Drop. Instantaneously, 600-pound Mark 9 depth charges, ash cans roll off the stern racks. And this is the exact moment the attack fails. Because to drop those explosives without blowing his own rudder off, the captain has to order all ahead flank. The destroyer surges to 15 knots, its propellers churning the water into a frenzy of cavitation. That white noise completely blinds the ship's sonar transducer. For the next 2 minutes, the destroyer is deaf, blind, and sprinting away from the target. Down in the black water, the Japanese submarine commander hears the screws accelerate. He knows the Americans are blind. He simply turns his rudder 30 degrees to port. The depth charges detonate harmlessly in the empty ocean where he used to be. This wasn't bad luck. It was a statistical certainty. By 1944, British and American forces had launched 5,174 depth charge attacks. They confirmed only 85 kills. That is a failure rate of 98.4%. The Allies were trying to kill invisible snipers with a sledgehammer, and they were missing. To break this deadlock, the Navy didn't need a bigger explosion. They needed a captain who understood geometry better than he understood tradition. Geometry in the North Pacific meant solving a firing solution against a target you couldn't see, hiding in a medium that bent sound waves like a carnival mirror, all while moving across a chessboard the size of a continent. And in May 1944, the chessboard was set for the decisive clash of the war. The United States Navy was assembling the largest armada in history to strike the Marianas Islands. To stop them, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, had deployed a trap. He didn't use battleships, he used eyes. Toyoda established the NA scouting line, a tripwire of 7 advanced submarines, I-16, RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, RO-108, RO-105, and RO-109 strung out in a precise arc northeast of the Admiralty Islands. Their mission was not necessarily to fight, but to detect. If just one of these boats spotted the American carriers and radioed a contact report, the element of surprise for the invasion of Saipan would be lost. The Japanese fleet would ambush the Americans in what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. To clear this line, the U.S. Navy sent hunter-killer groups, but they sent them armed with a weapon that was fundamentally broken. The standard anti-submarine weapon of World War II was the Mark 9 depth charge. To the sailors, it was the ash can, a clumsy, barrel-shaped steel drum packed with 200 pounds of Torpex high explosive. It was a brute force instrument designed for a psychological war, not a tactical one. The concept was simple. You roll the drum off the back of the ship, it sinks to a preset depth, and a hydrostatic fuse detonates it. The crushing pressure wave buckles the submarine's hull plates, water rushes in, and gravity does the rest. But in practice, the ash can was a weapon of blind hope. The flaw lay in the delivery system itself. To drop a depth charge, a destroyer had to pass directly over the submarine's last known position. This created the dead time. As the destroyer approached the target, the sonar angle became too steep to maintain contact. At roughly 200 yards from the target, the ping would vanish. The destroyer was now deaf. Worse, to avoid blowing off their own stern with the explosion, the destroyer had to accelerate to flank speed. This sudden surge of engine RPMs created cavitation, millions of vacuum bubbles collapsing against the propeller blades. This noise didn't just alert the enemy. It washed out the destroyer's own sensors. Consider the tactical reality for the Japanese commander down in the dark. He is listening. He hears the rhythmic ping-ping-ping of the active sonar. He knows he is being hunted. Then, the pinging stops. He hears the roar of propellers throttling up. That sound is not a threat. It is a signal. It tells him, the Americans are overhead, they are moving fast, and they cannot hear anything. In that moment of silence, the Japanese commander executes a standard evasion. He orders hard rudder, flank speed, and a radical change in depth. He turns inside the destroyer's turning radius. By the time the ash cans sink to their detonation depth, which could take 15 to 20 seconds, the submarine is 300 yards away, listening to the distant rumble of harmless explosions. The ocean itself conspired to help him. The Pacific is not a uniform block of water. It is stratified by temperature. At a certain depth, usually between 100 and 300 feet. There is a sharp boundary called the thermocline. Above the line, the water is warm. Below, it is cold. When a sonar ping hits this layer, the change in density causes the sound wave to bend sharply downward or bounce off entirely, creating a shadow zone beneath the layer. A submarine sitting just 50 feet below the thermocline is effectively invisible to a standard destroyer's sonar. The acoustic energy passes right over the top of the hull, never returning a ping to the hunter. The Japanese knew this. Their submarine doctrine in 1944 was aggressive and sophisticated. The Roe-class coastal submarines on the NA line were small, maneuverable, and commanded by veterans who understood the limitations of American sonar. They knew that as long as they stayed deep and reacted to the sound of the destroyer's engines, the mathematics of the attack favored survival. The statistics were brutal. A destroyer captain had to guess the submarine's depth, guess its speed, and guess its future position, all while blindfolded for the final 2 minutes of the engagement. If he guessed wrong on any variable, the ocean swallowed the explosion, and the sub slipped away. The U.S. Navy needed a way to change the variables. They needed to stop guessing where the submarine would be and start shooting at where it was. They needed to maintain sonar contact all the way to the kill. They needed a weapon that didn't require the ship to run over the target, but allowed it to stand off and throw a punch. And most importantly, they needed to stop relying on the terrifying boom of the depth charge to confirm a kill. They needed to embrace a new counterintuitive philosophy: precision over power, silence over thunder. The answer to this tactical nightmare was sitting on the foredeck of a new class of ship, looking like a collection of rusted stovepipes. It was ugly, it was British, and most American crews hated it. But for the 7 submarines waiting on the NA line, it was the harbinger of extinction. That harbinger was the USS England, DE 635, a ship that, on paper, had no business hunting the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite. She was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, a D. In the hierarchy of naval architecture, the fleet destroyer was the thoroughbred racehorse, fast, heavily armed, and commanded by Annapolis graduates destined for admiralty. The DE was the workhorse. They were 70 feet shorter, 10 knots slower, and built cheaply in mass quantities to shepherd slow merchant convoys across the Atlantic. They were affectionately known as tin cans, but to the men serving aboard them, they felt more like disposable targets. But the England was commanded by a man who fit the ship perfectly, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton. At 37 years old, Pendleton was ancient for a first-time commanding officer. He wasn't a career ring-knocker from the Naval Academy. He was a reservist. He didn't possess the dashing aggressiveness of a fighter pilot. He possessed the cold, calculating patience of an actuary. While other captains chased the glory of surface engagements, Pendleton was obsessed with the unseen geometry of the underwater fight, and bolted to the 0-1 deck of his ship, just aft of the forward gun mount, sat the instrument of his obsession, the Mark 10 anti-submarine projector. The crew called it the Hedgehog. To the uninitiated sailor, the weapon looked ridiculous, a rectangular steel box bristling with 24 stationary spigots, resembling the quills of a porcupine. It didn't rotate, it didn't aim. To fire it, the helmsman had to physically steer the entire 1,400-ton ship at the target. But the genius of the Hedgehog lay in its heresy. It broke the fundamental rule of anti-submarine warfare. It fired forward. Unlike the depth charge, which required the ship to pass over the submarine and drop explosives off the stern, the Hedgehog launched its 24 projectiles in a high, arching mortar volley over the bow. They sailed 200 yards ahead of the ship, entering the water in a large elliptical pattern, roughly 140 feet wide by 120 feet long. This changed the physics of the attack entirely. Because the weapon fired ahead of the ship, England did not need to accelerate to escape the blast. Pendleton could approach a Japanese submarine at creep speed, barely 5 knots. At this low speed, the ship's propellers were quiet. The sonar transducer suffered zero interference from cavitation. The dead time gap that plagued depth charge attacks was erased. For the first time in naval history, the hunter could look the prey in the eye at the moment of the kill. The sonar operators could track the submarine's evasion maneuvers in real time, feeding corrections to the helm right up until the instant the mortars fired. But the innovation carried a psychological cost that terrified the crew. The Hedgehog projectiles were not hydrostatic. They were contact-fused. A A standard depth charge was designed to explode near the submarine, using the crushing density of water to buckle the hull. It was a grenade. The Hedgehog was a bullet. The 65-pound projectile would only detonate if it physically struck the metal hull of the submarine. If the volley missed by even 6 inches, the projectiles would sink silently to the bottom of the ocean. No explosion, no white geyser of water, no shaking of the deck plates, just silence. This silence was the weapon's greatest tactical strength and its greatest morale weakness. With depth charges, a missed attack still produced a violent, satisfying explosion that disrupted the enemy's hearing and boosted the crew's confidence. With the Hedgehog, a miss felt like failure. It was a binary weapon system, 0 or 1, silence or death. To the sailors on the main deck, the Hedgehog seemed like a gamble that required impossible precision. To hit a moving submarine, a target 300 feet long and barely 20 feet wide, hidden under 400 feet of black water, required a firing solution so accurate it bordered on prophecy. You weren't playing with horseshoes anymore. You were trying to drop a stone down a ventilation shaft from the top of a skyscraper. Pendleton, however, saw it differently. He understood that the depth charge was a weapon of probability that favored the submarine. The kill zone of a depth charge was small, but the evasion zone of a submarine during the dead time was huge. The Hedgehog inverted the math. It maintained the sonar solution, shrinking the submarine's evasion zone to almost nothing. He drilled his crew relentlessly on this concept. He turned the England into a machine of synchronized lethality, where the sonar operator, the plot officer, and the helmsman functioned as a single organism. But as the England steamed toward the NA line in May 1944, the crew's faith was fragile. They were heading into waters infested with the Emperor's finest submarines, armed with a weapon that 95% of the Navy regarded as a British toy that didn't work. They were about to find out that the silence of the Hedgehog was not a sign of failure. It was the sound of the enemy running out of time. But for the crew of the England, that silence was not reassuring, it was terrifying. In the visceral, adrenaline-fueled chaos of naval combat, silence feels like failure. A sailor on a destroyer is conditioned to associate fighting with concussion. When a 5-inch gun fires, the deck kicks. When a depth charge detonates, the hull rings like a struck bell, and a geyser of white water erupts 50 feet into the air. Even if you miss, the ocean shakes. You feel powerful. You feel like you are hurting the enemy. The Hedgehog offered none of this visceral feedback. When the firing lever was pulled, there was no roar of propellant, just a ripple of mechanical thumps as the firing pins struck the spigots. The 24 projectiles tumbled through the air like clumsy footballs, splashing into the water with less drama than a man falling overboard. Then, nothing. Unless a projectile physically struck the submarine's hull, the contact fuse remained inert. The heavy steel bombs simply sank to the bottom of the abyss, lost forever. To the men on the fantail, watching the empty circles of foam on the surface, it felt like throwing rocks at a shark. It felt impotent. The data seemed to confirm their fears. Early combat trials in the Atlantic had been a disaster. The initial success rate for Hedgehog attacks hovered around 5%. Most destroyer captains, raised on the violent orthodoxy of the depth charge, requested to have the British contraptions removed from their decks to make room for more 40mm anti-aircraft guns. They argued that the weapon was too finicky, the pattern too small, and the lack of an explosion deprived the sonar operators of the water hammer effect needed to possibly damage a sub's delicate instruments, even with a near miss. By May 1944, the Hedgehog was widely regarded within the fleet as a theoretical marvel and a practical failure. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton stood alone against this wall of institutional rejection. He argued that the water hammer of a depth charge was actually the enemy's greatest ally. Yes, a near-miss depth charge might rattle a submarine, but the resulting explosion scrambled the ocean's acoustics for 15 minutes. It gave the enemy a smoke screen of sound. "I don't need thunder," Pendleton told his executive officer. "I need a hole in the pressure hull." But Pendleton was an unproven commodity, and so was his ship. As they steamed toward the NA line to join the hunter-killer group, the USS England possessed a combat record that was perfectly clean. 0 kills, 0 assists, 0 contacts. They were the green boat. The rookies trailing behind the more experienced destroyers, George and Raby. The mood in the mess deck was tense. The sailors knew they were being sent to hunt the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine Squadron 7, a unit composed of veteran crews who had survived the brutal attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. These weren't panicked novices. These were cold-blooded killers who knew the thermal layers of the Pacific better than they knew the streets of Tokyo. To hunt them, the crew of the England had to trust a reserve officer who talked about geometry and a weapon system that refused to explode. They felt like they were bringing a slide rule to a knife fight. On the afternoon of May 19th, the waiting ended. The radio room aboard the flagship crackled with a decoded transmission from Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC. Intelligence had intercepted a position report from I-16. The Japanese submarine was carrying a cargo of rice and rubber to the starving garrison at Buin, but she had diverted to the scouting line. She was 5 miles away. As the general quarters alarm screamed through the ship, bong, 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 the theoretical debate about the Hedgehog evaporated. This was no longer a drill. The men sprinted to their battle stations, strapping on helmets and life vests, their hearts hammering against their ribs. On the bridge, Pendleton was a statue of calm. He ordered the ship to slow to 10 knots, then 5. The George and the Raby, sticking to traditional doctrine, surged ahead, their wakes churning white. They were eager to use their depth charges. They wanted to make noise. Pendleton held back. He watched the sonar plot, listening to the rhythmic ping, ping of the return signal. He was entering the arena of the unseen war, and he was betting the lives of his 186 crewmen on a simple, terrifying premise: that mathematics was more lethal than gunpowder. The sonar operator called out the range. Target distinct. Range 1 to 1,500 yards. Closing. The silence on the deck was absolute. No engines roaring. No wind screaming. Just the electric hum of the ship and the heavy, oppressive heat of the equator. The England crept forward, a silent predator stalking a monster in the dark. And for the first time, the crew realized that the lack of noise wasn't a weakness. It was the only reason the enemy didn't know they were already dead. The death of I-16 began not with a roar, but with a stopwatch. At 1,341 hours on May 19th, Lieutenant Commander Pendleton ordered the first salvo. The 24 mortar rounds arced gracefully over the bow, splashing into the Pacific in a perfect elliptical ring. The England held her breath. Seconds ticked by. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. Silence. Miss, the sonar operator reported flatly. The projectiles had sunk to the bottom, their contact fuses inert. The submarine had jagged hard to starboard, slipping out of the noose. On any other destroyer, this was the moment of failure, the moment where the captain would curse, accelerate to flank speed, and blind himself for a second pass. But Pendleton didn't accelerate. He maintained his creep speed, holding the sonar beam directly on the fleeing submarine like a spotlight on a burglar. He watched the stylus on the plotting table trace the enemy's turn. He adjusted the deflection. Fire 2. The second salvo splashed down. This time, as the stopwatch hit the predicted impact time, the hull of the England rang with a sharp, metallic clank. It wasn't the thunder of a depth charge. It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting a boiler. But 4 seconds later, the physics of the deep took over. A massive, terrifying shudder lifted the destroyer's fantail clear out of the water. The ocean surface behind the ship boiled white as oil, deck planking, and the shattered remnants of I-16 erupted from the depths. The contact-fused projectiles had punched a hole in the pressure hull, and the violent release of the submarine's internal air, combined with the detonation of her own torpedoes, had vaporized her. 1 kill. The crew cheered, but Pendleton remained fixed on the plot. 1 kill could be luck. 3 days later, on May 22nd, the hunting group cornered RO 106. This was a different beast. RO 106 was a coastal hunter, nimble and fast. The destroyer George spotted her first on radar at 0350 hours, illuminating the sub with a searchlight before she crash-dived. George rushed in, fired a Hedgehog salvo, and missed. Then George dropped depth charges, blinding her own sensors. The Japanese commander of RO 106 was good. He went deep 380 feet and began knuckling. He would jam his rudder hard over, creating a swirl of turbulent water that reflected sonar pings, creating a ghost target to decoy the Americans. Standard destroyers were helpless against this. Their sonar transducers were fixed horizontally. They could scan the horizon, but they couldn't look down. Once a sub went below 300 feet, it entered the sonar's blind spot beneath the ship. But the England had a secret weapon paired with her Hedgehog, the QCS sonar, or searchlight sonar. Unlike the wide fanning pulse of standard gear, the QCS emitted a narrow, concentrated beam that could be tilted vertically. Pendleton didn't just scan the horizon. He tilted his beam down, piercing the blind spot, ignoring the decoys, and locking onto the solid steel mass of the submarine hiding in the cold water. Target depth 380, range 1,200. Pendleton fed the data into the firing solution. He led the target by 300 feet. The second salvo hit. 3 distinct detonations tore the RO-106 apart. 2 kills. This was no longer luck. This was a system. By the morning of May 23rd, the dynamic of the hunter-killer group had shifted. The England was no longer the junior partner. She was the executioner. When the group detected RO-104, the frustration aboard the flagship was palpable. The division commander, Commander Hamilton Haynes, watched as the destroyer Raby made 4 separate attacks on the contact. Raby fired Hedgehog. Miss. Raby dropped depth charges. Miss. George moved in. Miss. The Japanese commander of RO-104 was playing the vertical game, diving to 400 feet, then rising to 200, confusing the fuse settings of the American depth charges. For hours, the ocean erupted in white geysers, but the submarine kept moving. The other captains were guessing. At 0819 hours, Commander Haynes looked at the plotting board. He saw George and Raby exhausting their ammunition and their patience. He picked up the radio handset. He didn't issue a complex tactical order. He simply yielded to the geometry. "Oh hell," Haynes radioed. "Go ahead, England." Pendleton didn't hesitate. He moved the England into the firing lane, his sonar operators already tracking the depth oscillations of the enemy. He didn't try to bracket the target. He calculated the mean intersection point of the submarine's sine wave evasion pattern. The England fired 2 salvos. The second salvo, at 0834, resulted in 10 detonations. The explosions were so violent they sounded like a continuous drum roll. RO-104 disintegrated instantly. 3 submarines. 4 days. The crew of the England had stopped cheering. A grim, professional rhythm had taken over. They realized they weren't just hunting. They were clearing a minefield. The British toy on the foredeck had transformed into the scythe of the Pacific. But as the England turned her bow toward the next coordinate on the NA line, the Japanese were finally realizing that something was wrong. The silence from their scouting line was deafening. And the next commander on the list, the captain of RO-116, decided that if he couldn't hide from the Americans, he would try to outthink them. He was about to change the rules of the game. The rules changed because the enemy stopped panicking and started thinking. When RO-116 and RO-108, the 4th and 5th victims, met the England over the next 4 days, their commanders tried to exploit the weapon's perceived weakness. They stayed shallow, betting that the contact fuses wouldn't arm, or they dove past 400 feet, betting the projectiles would drift off target during the long sink time. Pendleton killed them both. He adjusted his fuse settings for the shallow runner and led the deep diver by an extra 50 yards. By May 26th, 5 submarines were dead. The NA line had been severed, but 1 submarine remained, RO-105. And her commander, Lieutenant Commander Rikinosuke, was a different breed of sailor. He was a master of the acoustic environment. When the England's hunter-killer group finally cornered him on May 30th, Rikinosuke didn't run. He didn't panic. He took his ship down to 300 feet, right beneath a jagged thermal layer that acted like a mirror for sonar, and he stopped his engines. For the crew of the England, the turkey shoot was over. The nightmare had begun. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It was a siege. For 24 agonizing hours, RO-105 ghosted through the formation. Every time George or Raby established contact and moved in for a run, Rikinosuke would execute a knuckle. He would jam his rudder hard over while kicking his engines for a split second. This created a swirling vortex of disturbed water that reflected sonar energy exactly like a solid object. The American destroyers would attack the knuckle, blowing up empty water, while RO-105 slipped away in the acoustic chaos. Pendleton watched this happen again and again. He saw his sister ships wasting depth charges, blinding themselves and losing the target. But he had a more pressing problem than frustration. He was running out of bullets. The England had started the patrol with a full magazine of Hedgehog projectiles, But 5 kills had drained her lockers. By the morning of May 31st, as they regained contact with RO-105, Pendleton received a report from his gunnery officer that turned his blood cold. They were down to their last few salvos. They didn't have enough ammunition to guess. If they fired, they had to hit. At 0700 hours, RO-105 made a mistake. Forced to recharge her batteries, she came up to periscope depth, was spotted, and immediately crash-dived back to the safety of the deep. But this time, Pendleton had a solid fix. He moved the England into position, his sonar operators straining to pierce the thermal layer. The contact was mushy, fading in and out as the submarine moved between cold and warm water currents. "Target is turning," the sonarman called out. "Port turn, now starboard turn." Rikinosuke was weaving. He wasn't just turning randomly, he was oscillating his course in a sine wave, a rhythmic swaying motion designed to make a firing solution impossible. If Pendleton aimed where the sub was, the projectiles would land where the sub had been. If he led the target to the left, the sub would be swinging back to the right by the time the mortars hit the water. Pendleton stared at the plotting board. He watched the stylus trace the snake-like path of the enemy. He ignored the noise. He looked for the pattern. Human beings, even highly trained Japanese commanders, are terrible at generating randomness. We crave rhythm. Pendleton noticed that Rikinosuke's turns were timing out perfectly. Port for 2 minutes. Starboard for 2 minutes. It was a pendulum. Pendleton waited. He let the England creep forward, holding his fire, letting the precious seconds tick away. He had to fire not at the submarine, but at the invisible point in the ocean where the pendulum would swing next. He waited for the submarine to begin its turn to starboard. He knew the Japanese commander was committed to that turn for the next 120 seconds. "Fire," Pendleton whispered. The England's forward spigots thumped. 24 dark shapes vaulted into the air, the last of the ship's lethal inventory. They hung at the apex of their arc, then plunged into the water. 17 seconds of sink time. Down in the dark, row 105 was completing her swing, just as the math predicted. The commander likely heard the splash, but he was locked into his maneuver. On the surface, the ocean remained flat. 5 seconds passed. 10. The crew on the fantail gripped the railing. If this missed, the England was a toothless tiger. She would have to withdraw. Then, the sea erupted. It wasn't a single explosion. It was a chain reaction. 6 separate Hedgehog projectiles struck the pressure hull of RO-105 simultaneously. The combined force of the warheads, detonating directly against the steel plates, didn't just breach the hull. It shattered the submarine's structural spine. A massive, roiling dome of oil and debris boiled to the surface, followed by a shockwave that slapped the England's hull like a giant hand. 6 submarines. 12 days. The magazines were empty. The NA line was empty. The duel was over. The England had not just defeated the enemy, she had solved them. But the reward for solving the most dangerous problem in the Pacific wasn't a parade. It was silence, followed by fire. The destruction of the NA scouting line rippled across the theater with catastrophic consequences for the Japanese Empire. Because England had erased Admiral Toyoda's eyes, the massive American carrier task force sailing for the Marianas remained undetected. The Japanese fleet, blind and confused, stumbled into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American Hellcats swatted over 300 Japanese aircraft out of the sky. Tactically, the England had saved thousands of lives. Strategically, she had unlocked the door to Tokyo. But in the cold calculus of industrial warfare, a ship that has fulfilled its purpose becomes just another hull number on a ledger. Pendleton and his crew were rotated out, their slide rules and firing solutions studied by intelligence officers who would codify their instincts into fleet-wide doctrine. The England herself was sent back to the grinder. She spent the summer of 1,944 screening convoys, a shepherd once again. Then came October 31st. While patrolling northwest of Leyte Gulf, a single Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber peeled out of the sun. The Japanese pilot wasn't interested in dropping a bomb. He was the bomb. The England's anti-aircraft gunners spotted him late. The 20mm Oerlikons chattered, tracers reaching up to stitch the sky. But the Val was in a terminal dive. The plane slammed into the starboard side, just below the bridge, crashing directly into the forward officer's wardroom. The aviation fuel ignited instantly, turning the interior of the ship into a blast furnace. The 550-pound bomb the plane was carrying detonated deep inside the hull, tearing through the main deck and obliterating the forward engine room. 37 men died in the flash. 25 were burned or wounded. The ship that had killed 6 submarines without a scratch was now drifting, burning, and broken. But the final insult wasn't the kamikaze. It was the calculator. The England managed to limp back to the fleet anchorage at Manus. She was battered, but she was afloat. Her keel was true. Her heart, the crew, was ready to rebuild. In any previous war, a ship with her record would have been preserved, repaired, and paraded as a symbol of national resolve. She was the giant killer. But World War II was not a romantic war. It was a war of production lines. Navy Marine surveyors boarded the burnt hulk. They didn't see a hero, they saw a spreadsheet. They calculated the man-hours required to repair the structural damage to the forward engine room. Then, they looked at the cost of simply building a brand new Buckley-class Escort in a shipyard in Philadelphia. The math was merciless. It was cheaper to build a new ship than to fix the old one. The order came down from Washington. Do not repair. The England was towed to Philadelphia, stripped of her guns, her radar, and her legendary Hedgehog launchers. On the 26th of November 1946, the ship that had single-handedly dismantled the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force was sold to a scrapping firm. She was cut apart with torches. Her high-tensile steel, which had withstood the pressure of the Pacific, was melted down to make girders, car fenders, and razor blades. The physical vessel vanished. This prompted a rare moment of sentimentality from the highest levels of the U.S. Navy. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, a man so tough it was said he shaved with a blowtorch, issued a pledge. He declared, "There will always be an England in the United States Navy." It was a promise to honor the lineage of the ultimate hunter-killer. For a while, they kept it. In 1962, the guided missile cruiser USS England, CG-22, was commissioned. She served honorably for 3 decades in Vietnam and the Persian Gulf. But in 1994, CG-22 was decommissioned. And in the 30 years since, the Navy has broken Admiral King's promise. There is no USS England in the fleet today. No destroyer, no frigate, no submarine bears the name. The tragedy of the England is not that she was forgotten, but that she was a victim of her own success. By proving that anti-submarine warfare was a matter of silence and geometry, she helped transform the Navy from a collection of heroic captains into a digitized system of engagement. She perfected the science of killing so thoroughly that she rendered the art of the hunt and herself obsolete. The weapon she championed, the Hedgehog, became standard issue. The tactics Pendleton devised became the textbook. The England was dissolved, atom by atom, into the very doctrine of the modern Navy. She exists not as a museum ship you can tour, but as the ghostly algorithm inside every sonar computer hunting in the deep today. But if you look closely at the history books, the math still stands undefeated. 5,174 depth charge attacks for 85 kills. One ship, 12 days, 6 kills. The difference wasn't luck. It was the decision to trust the quiet truth of numbers over the comforting noise of tradition. That decision to trust the quiet truth of numbers over the comforting noise of tradition is the real legacy of Walton Pendleton. He proved that in the terrifying calculus of modern war, courage isn't always about charging into machine gun fire or enduring the loudest explosion. Sometimes, courage is the discipline to remain silent while everyone else is screaming for noise. The 12 days of the England's patrol did more than just clear a path for the invasion of Saipan. They shattered the psychological reliance on brute force that had plagued the U.S. Navy since Pearl Harbor. Before Pendleton, the fleet believed that the solution to a difficult problem was more explosives, more depth charges, bigger barrages, wider patterns. They were trying to bludgeon the ocean into submission. Pendleton showed them that the ocean doesn't care about force. It respects only precision. Today, the ghost of the England haunts every modern warship in the world. If you step onto the bridge of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, you won't find hedgehogs, but you will find the philosophy they birthed. Modern anti-submarine warfare is built entirely on the principles Pendleton vindicated: the use of standoff weapons that keep the ship quiet, the integration of thermal layer analysis into firing solutions, and the absolute reliance on sensors over eyesight. The searchlight sonar has evolved into the massive bow-mounted phased arrays that can track a submarine's propeller wash from miles away. The Hedgehog projectile has evolved into the RUM-139VL ASROC, a rocket-thrown torpedo that flies through the air to the target's location before dropping into the water, ensuring the firing ship never has to blind itself with speed. Walton Pendleton and his crew of reservists didn't just sink 6 submarines. They took the art of war, which was messy and emotional, and turned it into a science. They proved that a green crew with a calculator is deadlier than a veteran crew with a sledgehammer. But the England was the master of defense, the shield that protected the fleet. What happens when you take that same spirit of heretical innovation and apply it to the offense? What happens when a submarine commander decides that sinking ships is too boring and decides to declare war on the land itself? Join us in the next video as we uncover the story of Commander Eugene Fluckey and the USS Barb, the submarine that didn't just hunt in the water, but modified its own systems to blow up a railroad train on the coast of Japan. If this deep dive into the mechanics of history gave you a new perspective on the Pacific War, hit that subscribe button. The algorithm promotes the loudest videos, but we, like the England, prefer the precision of the dedicated few. Like this video to help us break the dead time of the YouTube feed, and let us know in the comments, was the Navy right to scrap the England, or should she be sitting in a museum today? Dismissed.